Hey everyone! I'd like to give you a little bit more background to help support your reading of 1984. Some of this information is going to repeat the information that you researched in your web quest, but much of the information is going to be relatively new to you. So I'm hoping that it will help you to understand what you're reading in the first part of the novel. George Orwell was born Eric Blair in 1903 in India. At the time, India was under British rule. Orwell's father was a British colonial officer who was involved in the exportation of opium, a drug used to make morphine and heroin in China. Believe it or not, at the time, exporting these drugs was legal. Orwell was educated at the top private schools. However, he decided not to go to college and instead became a police officer. After 5 years, Orwell quit the police force and tried his hand at writing. Orwell traveled around the world and studied the conditions of people living in poverty, especially after the economic crash of 1929. Orwell disguised himself as a homeless person in order to write the most truthful account that he could. He then described his experience living among the poor and destitute in and around the two cities in his memoir, Down and Out in Paris and London. It was Orwell's first book length publication and the first work to appear under the pseudonym George Orwell. This also marks the beginning of Orwell's preoccupation with social inequality, a theme that runs through all of his works. He was hired by the British government to explore poverty in England, where Orwell found much to criticize. Orwell sided with the communists in the Spanish Civil War. This war was fought between a Republican left and a nationalist right. The Republicans were defeated and fascism took hold in Spain. Orwell saw a lot of violence, particularly infighting among his own side, and left the war badly wounded and disillusioned. He continued to find work as a journalist throughout World War II and published Animal Farm, a political allegory, in 1944. 1984 was first published in 1949. Orwell died a year later of tuberculosis in 1950. In 1949, the United States and other countries were working to contain the Soviet Union's expansion, not by fighting them directly, but by supporting opposing forces, known as the Cold War. In the United States, there was intense anti communist sentiment and a fear that communists were infiltrating the government. Also known as the Red Scare, this movement was led by Joseph McCarthy, a senator who conducted investigations into private citizens, especially those in the arts, and subjected them to public congressional hearings. Orwell would have witnessed this firsthand, and so his novel is often seen as a critique of the present or as a warning about what the future may hold. Still, the story has been interpreted in many different ways by people with different political leanings. One might argue that a person's interpretation of 1984 is influenced by their own political beliefs. The novel is set in 1984, but was published in 1949 at the start of the Cold War. It's important to understand the difference between the two political and economic philosophies, capitalism and communism or socialism. Orwell appeared to support socialism, but his novel paints a very dark portrait of a future under a socialist government. Having witnessed the dark side of communism and socialism in totalitarian leaders like Joseph Stalin, perhaps Orwell intended the novel to be a warning. Orwell identified himself as a democratic socialist. Totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and fascism are the extreme results of communist or socialist governments. Oceania, the setting for 1984, is a full blown fascist state. In a full blown fascist state, there are the extremes of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. There is a dictator who holds ultimate power. The government controls all of industry and commerce. Any opposing thoughts are suppressed in a violent manner. Often the military is involved in suppressing people who want to move against the government. There is torture, there is violence, and state stays in a constant preparedness for war. So it is a wartime economy. They're manufacturing instruments of war and always ready to be fighting. Fortunately, after World War II, fascist governments really didn't survive or thrive. In Orwell's novel, the world has been divided into three sections: Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. The main character, Winston Smith, lives in London, a part of Oceania. So he would be living here. Okay. London is the capital of the province of Airstrip 1. Because the ruling party controls much of the information, Winston is not sure what year it is. His best guess is that the year is 1984. This would be the future for the audience reading the novel in 1949. The city of Oceania is dominated by four large buildings, and they represent the four ministries of the party: the Ministry of Love, the Ministry of Peace, the Ministry of Plenty, and the Ministry of Truth. The Ministry of Love is in charge of law and punishment. There is a great deal of torture that occurs in the Ministry of Love. The Ministry of Peace is in charge of war, maintaining a wartime economy and being constantly ready for war. The Ministry of Plenty manages rationing, so they decide the number of razor blades or how much chocolate people are going to get. So they are in charge of actually keeping things from people. And the Ministry of Truth, where Winston works, produces propaganda. In the Ministry of Truth, the people that work there alter newspapers and books and newsreels and other documents to suit the narrative of the government. So if Oceania is at war with East Asia, then the people who work at the Ministry of Truth have to go back and change all of the newspapers and history books to reflect the idea that they've always been at war with East Asia. If the war switches to another area, Eurasia, then again, they have to go back and switch all of that. When a person is found to be a traitor, they are basically erased from all documents. And so that is what Winston does for his job. And you'll notice that each one of these ministries actually does the opposite of what their name implies. And that is definitely a deliberate choice on Orwell's part so that you can see how upside down and paradoxical this society is. London itself is pretty much devastated by a state of constant war. Most of the beautiful architecture that existed there is gone or is crumbling. There are few buildings left. St. Clement's Church is one that is mentioned, but it only exists as ruins and memories of an earlier and forgotten time period. There are three basic social classes in 1984. One is the inner party, and the inner party is the uppermost class. They have a good deal of money and they live in comfort. They have servants and they are entitled to luxury goods. The outer party lives in very dilapidated, stark, impoverished conditions. That would be Winston's class. And you can tell immediately with the narrator's description of Victory Mansions in chapter 1 that it's not a pleasant place to live. It smells, the elevator doesn't work, there's problems with the plumbing, and it's not pleasant. The members of the outer party have very little control over personal space or property. The telescreen is constantly in their lives, in their rooms, in their homes. It's always on. You can't shut it off. If you talk in your sleep and you say something treasonous, you could be arrested and thrown into the Ministry of Love and be tortured. So it's not a pleasant experience at all. The lowest class in Oceania is a group called the Proles. And the Proles live in a slum of Oceania. And it's a very poor area that the government doesn't keep much of an eye on. They don't try to exert much control over the area because the people are largely uneducated and really couldn't gather as a force to overthrow the government. So the government pretty much leaves them be. And in a lot of ways, the Proles have more choices than the folks in the inner and the outer party. The proles can marry for love. They can have as many children as they want. So even though they're the lowest and most impoverished social group, in a way, they have a little more independence. Just a few terms to know as you read the novel. The telescreen, which you read about in chapter 1, is a surveillance device. It looks like a television, but it's installed in every household. It's used by the state to monitor the populace. So, they can catch any anti-government thoughts or any activities to overthrow the government. People cannot shut it off. And so, again, it's a constant presence. Big Brother is the leader of Oceania. Big Brother's face is plastered on posters all over the city with the slogan, Big Brother is watching you under it. Big Brother is not an actual person. He's a figurehead. And so people think, a lot of people do think that he's real, but he's not. He's just a figurehead. Emmanuel Goldstein is the enemy of Big Brother and the enemy of Oceania. The Brotherhood is a legendary group of men and women who oppose Oceania and Big Brother and who are constantly plotting to overthrow the government. INGSOC is just an acronym for English socialism. It's the philosophy adopted when the Socialist Party began to rule in Oceania. Newspeak is the official language of Oceania. And ironically enough, every year we add words to our dictionary here, but in Newspeak, the objective is to eliminate words from the dictionary. So Newspeak, people who work on the Newspeak dictionary are trying to eliminate words and combine words so that eventually, you will only need a handful of words to express what you need to in Oceania. The Junior Anti-Sex League is a group that advocates complete celibacy. Julia, the young woman that Winston notices in the 2 Minutes Hate, is a member of the Junior Anti-Sex League. So they're basically vowing to be celibate, and they advocate for that for both sexes. 2 Minutes Hate and Hate Week are psychological operations. So these activities serve two purposes. The first purpose is to whip up people's hatred for the enemies of the party. So whether it be a country that Oceania is at war with, or Emmanuel Goldstein and his group, they conduct these activities to get people to yell and scream and just express their hatred for enemies, who they feel their enemies are. But it also serves another purpose in that people are able to sort of purge themselves of their hatred for their own situation. So their anger over the fact that they live in poverty and that they, can only get chocolate once in a while and that they have to ration razor blades. These are all things that, probably weigh on them. And so the hate activities during the 2 Minutes Hate and Hate Week, though those activities help them to kind of express that anger and direct it somewhere else. The thought police or think pol are the secret police of the superstate. They look for thought crimes, which are personal and political thoughts that are unapproved by the party or that may be considered rebellious or insubordinate. Doublethink is the ability to hold two completely contradictory thoughts simultaneously while believing both of them to be true. So if you look at the three statements, war is peace, ignorance is strength, slavery is freedom, those are examples of doublethink. Because in order to believe those statements to be true, you have to accept the fact that they're contradictory. Okay, so you have to accept the fact that in order to have peace, we have to be in a constant state of war. Okay, in order to have strength, you have to be in a constant state of ignorance. Ignorance is a good thing. And in order to be truly free, you have to be somehow enslaved. So those statements are contradictory, but as a member of Oceania, you are expected to hold those statements to be true. Again, thought crime are just unspoken beliefs and doubts that contradict the beliefs in the ideology of Oceania. And if you are found to be guilty of thought crime, then you can be arrested and you can be placed in the ministry of love and tortured. And that is it. So I hope that this slideshow kind of helps you to understand a little bit more some of the terms and some of the characters and some of the situations in the novel.